I wish I could tell you that if you are a person who is, between 5'7" and 6 feet tall, and you have blue eyes or brown eyes, that the sativa varieties are going to be right for you, or that the sativa varieties are going to give you panic attacks. I can't do that. The only way to determine it would be to actually experience ingesting those or smoking those, which is certainly also not what I'm suggesting, right? That's up to you. I'm not telling you what to do or what not to do. But there are no good predictors. In fact, if you look in the literature, it is not at all clear that people who have a heightened level of anxiety when they do not smoke cannabis will experience cannabis as less paranoia-inducing or more relaxing. That's simply not the case. Now, what we can say for sure is that general categories of effects, such as increased focus and reduced anxiety, are largely due to activation of areas like the prefrontal cortex. Now, unlike other compounds like nicotine or alcohol or neurotransmitter systems like dopamine, when we talk about the cannabinoid system, and I say effects, biological effects, psychoactive effects, I want you to keep in mind always, please, 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 keep in mind that those effects can be varied and often opposite in direction. So let's just give an example of that. I just mentioned that when people smoke or eat sativa, that it tends to lead to one specific set of, or generally leads to one specific set of effects, heightened focus, mood, etc. Whereas when they ingest or smoke indica and its components, right? Again, we're still talking about THC and CBD in varying ratios, but now indica cannabis, and you say, well, why would it improve the transition time to sleep? Or at least give people the impression that it improved the transition time to sleep. We'll talk about what indica actually does for sleep in a little bit. But indica also tends to suppress activation of the amygdala and threat detection centers in the brain, again, binding the same CB1 receptors and those retrograde signaling mechanisms I talked about before. But it also tends to shut down the hippocampus, an area of the brain associated with memory, which is why indica varieties lead to pronounced, or I should say profound, defects in short-term memory and sometimes in long-term memory as well if it's consumed over long periods of time. We'll talk about short, medium, and long-term consumption, occasional consumption going forward. So what I'd like you to take away from this component of the discussion is, first of all, the mechanism of action by which cannabis impacts the brain and body, but in particular the brain, is going to be through CB1 receptors, and those CB1 receptors can lead to either an acceleration or a brake on particular biological mechanisms, and there are going to be a constellation of different accelerations and braking of different neural systems in the brain and body, depending on whether or not people ingest sativa or indica or some hybrid strain. And perhaps most importantly, even if you didn't understand anything that I've said about the biology of these different strains and the receptors, please do understand that there is no way to predict what the effect of a given strain will be on an individual. There has been extensive exploration as to whether or not people who are so-called mellower or more anxious or any number of different personality dimensions will respond in one way or the other, but in fact, there is no way to tell. Layer on top of that the fact that dosing THC and CBD can be fairly straightforward in the form of edibles, right? Because there can be, at least if it's a controlled source, a defined number of milligrams of THC, a defined number of milligrams of CBD. That's true for ingestibles. It's much harder to gauge that from the smokable forms of cannabis, especially if those smokable forms of cannabis are obtained through sources where there isn't a lot of clear information about the total amount of THC in that product. Now, this is all changing quite a lot nowadays because of the commercialization of THC and CBD products and cannabis in a number of different areas, including in the United States. But still, many people are ingesting cannabis, THC, CBD through sources where they don't really know how much they're bringing into their system. And so whether or not someone gets incredible anxiety relief, enhanced sense of mood and focus and well-being, pain relief, etc., or whether or not they have full-blown panic attacks, etc., is very hard to predict based on dosage information alone. Now, of course, we can create broad categories, and we're going to talk about studies that create broad categories of low dose, moderate dose, and high dose, frequent use and infrequent use. But unlike alcohol, unlike nicotine, we can't really point to specificity of X amount of alcohol, grams of alcohol per week, which is safe, or X amount of alcohol, which is not safe. And so I know a lot of people out there are wondering, how often can they smoke cannabis, or how often can they eat cannabis or THC or CBD in any number of its different forms and products safely? Well, we have to really define what safely means, and we have to really acknowledge that there's a pretty loose set of controls over what one is bringing into their brain and body as they ingest THC and CBD. But even under conditions in which it's very controlled, it's very hard to predict what those effects will be. So before moving into specifics of taking cannabis or not taking cannabis, who should, who shouldn't, what the medicinal purposes are, and what some of the newer exciting data point to, I just briefly want to make a list, and I promise very briefly. I know I'm not often concise, but I do try to be thorough for your sake. I want to make a very brief list of the different brain areas that are impacted by THC and CBD, and why THC and CBD have the various effects they do. When somebody smokes or ingests cannabis, doesn't matter what the THC or CBD ratio is, if they experience deficits in memory, and that's almost always present, that's going to be because of reductions in electrical activity within this brain region we call the hippocampus. Okay? Hippocampus means seahorse. It's shaped like a seahorse. Anatomists like to name things after what things look like. But hippocampus memory is reduced, in particular short-term memory. That's true regardless of whether or not one is using sativa, indica, or some hybrid. In general, the prefrontal cortex is going to be activated by the sativa varieties, which is going to increase thinking and narrowly constrain focus to some activity. And that's more commonly associated with the sativa varieties. The indica varieties, as I mentioned before, tend to lead to a suppression of activity in prefrontal cortex, believe it or not, and turn off thinking and planning. This is why indica varieties are often used for relaxation and for promoting sleep. Regardless of whether or not sativa or indica variety, and again, regardless of the ratio of THC to CBD, there is a general suppression of neural circuits within the so-called basal ganglia and cerebellum. Basal ganglia and cerebellum are areas of the brain that are involved in action planning and withholding action. So that would be the basal ganglia, so-called go, no-go circuitry. And the cerebellum, which is involved in balance, but also motor planning and motor sequencing. This is why people who smoke marijuana, regardless of the strain, will tend to be less physically mobile. Other common effects are reddening of the eyes, dryness of the mouth. That's actually caused by the same general mechanism, which is a reduction in the secretion of saliva and of sort of tears and lubrication of the eyes from the lacrimal glands of the eyes because of the presence of largely CB2, but also CB1 receptors in the mouth and on the eyes. And there tends to be, especially with certain strains of cannabis, increase in appetite, the so-called munchies. And that has everything to do with very, very high density of CB1 receptors in the hypothalamus, and in particular areas of the hypothalamus, like the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus, other areas as well, of course, that have tons of CB1 receptors, bind THC and CBD, and activate the neurons that strongly stimulate appetite through two mechanisms. One is a cognitive mechanism of creating a preoccupation with food and anticipation of taste, as well as the experience of taste. So the narrowing of focus to what you want to go eat, right? You really crave, pizza. It seems to be high fat, high carbohydrate foods, but really crave pizza, and narrowing of focus so that you're not thinking about anything else, but also signaling from the hypothalamus to the gut, to neurons within the stomach itself that regulate blood sugar. So there are strong effects on blood sugar of THC and CBD that generally lead to increases in appetite. So two parallel mechanisms, one within the brain, one within the body, increasing appetite. Okay, so there's an array of different effects. And as I mentioned before, CB1 receptors are present all over the nervous system in the brain, the spinal cord. In fact, the presence of CB1 receptors in the spinal cord largely explains the fact that THC and CBD, to some extent, although it's not very well studied, can provide some pain relief. I should say some, because a lot of people perceive or believe that they experience more pain relief from cannabis than they actually do. It actually has a lot to do with a perceptual shift to basically focusing on other things, but there does seem to be some anti-nociceptive, meaning anti-pain effects of cannabis, THC in particular, and that is exerted largely through effects on CB1 receptors in neurons of the spinal cord. So a broad array of effects are taking place, regardless of what strain you take and whether or not you eat the cannabis or you smoke the cannabis. And the broad array of effects can be explained by the fact that that retrograde signaling can lead to activation or suppression of activity in various neurons. So now I'd like to take a step back from the biology of cannabis and THC and CBD and all the signaling and receptors, et cetera, and really just focus on cannabis use. And wherever possible, I will point to the specific strains that have been studied and the ratios of THC to CBD. But I have to say that unfortunately, most studies of marijuana, of cannabis, while they have been very careful to detail the amount of THC, low dose, medium dose, or high dose, and actually getting very specific, right down to the number of milligrams or even how much circulating THC is present after somebody smokes a joint or ingests cannabis, most studies have not distinguished between sativa and indica strains. And that's unfortunate because in the real world, people are distinguishing between sativa and indica strains in their patterns of use and what they prefer and what they don't prefer, even what they prefer to smoke during the day or ingest during the day versus night. Believe it or not, there are people who are using certain strains during the day and other strains at night. But the science is yet to catch up to that, or I should say more accurately, the general public and the themes that are emerging and the practices that are emerging around cannabis, especially in states where it's decriminalized or legalized, are occurring at such a rapid rate that there's absolutely no way that the science could keep up. This is a naturally occurring experiment. Not to say that it's natural, like people should do it, but it's an experiment that's happening in real time in the real world, much faster than controlled studies within university laboratories and other laboratories can keep up. So at this point, I think it's appropriate to ask ourselves, why do people even use cannabis? I mean, what are they trying to achieve? Is it always about not feeling pain? Is it always about reducing anxiety? Well, sometimes it is, but oftentimes people are using cannabis in order to achieve a particular state. And we could use a broad brush and say, well, they just like being high. But while that may be true in a lot of circumstances, and I have to believe it actually is true in a lot of circumstances, there are a lot of people who use cannabis in a very directed way, or they get quote unquote high in order to achieve states that to them are particularly attractive. And one such state is a state of creativity. And this brings us to a broader theme, which is, does cannabis increase creativity? And if so, is it the THC, the CBD? What's the appropriate ratio or the best ratio for accessing creativity? This is an interesting and important discussion, I believe, because creativity is one of the more sought after and more elusive states that humans can experience. And yet, if you look at human evolution, you look at our progression in terms of technology development and culture and music and poetry, et cetera, we really can look to creativity as the state that fostered so much of that evolution. So whether or not you're into technology or you're into art or music, whether or not you're just somebody who wants to expand their understanding or their experience of life in some way, creativity is a fundamentally important state to try and access regularly and to try and tap into in order to eventually produce something, in order to create something of meaning that exists not just in that creative state, but to yourself after that creative state has gone away, right? So the painting that you paint in the creative state hopefully is a painting that still inspires and has impact after you exit that creative state, and that will inspire others. And this could be true for any number of different things, not just painting. So does cannabis increase creativity? The short answer is it depends. First of all, we need to define creativity, right? Here we are as thinking as scientists, if not already scientists. And there are basically two modes of thinking that are associated with creativity. And they don't completely explain creativity. But if you look in the research, the psychology research and the neuroscience research, you'll hear about convergent thinking and divergent thinking. Convergent thinking is taking loose ideas and kind of braiding them together, finding a common thread, synthesizing and organizing those different ideas into some common or specific framework in order to get or create some specific outcome. So convergent thinking is basically the person in the room who's listening to all the ideas and taking them all in. Maybe it's a panel of, how should we get a certain product out to market, or what are the different motifs that we should include in a piece of music, or what should we do in terms of re-architecting a given physical space, taking in those different opinions, those different ideas from different people, and then synthesizing them and coming up with one or a small subset of coherent ideas that incorporate some or all of the ones that they heard. Okay, so that's convergent thinking. It doesn't have to involve a panel of people talking to you. I use that as an example of what goes on inside your own head when you are engaging in convergent thinking. You're thinking, well, so-and-so said this, and I think that, and you're kind of braiding them through and trying to get some common theme, some common vector to emerge from that. Divergent thinking, on the other hand, is best described as brainstorming. It's exploring ideas and continuing to move into the variation and the vastness of ideas in hopes of eventually being able to converge on some novel idea or framework. Okay, so these are similar and related, but typically the creativity process involves first brainstorming and divergent thinking, and then in order to arrive at something, to actually create something, right? The verb create, not just thinking about what you might create, which occurs during divergent thinking, but actually creating something, a specific painting, a specific song, a specific body of literature, a specific scientific project or experiment, and so on. That usually involves convergent thinking. Now, these can be explored in the laboratory, and they can be explored in the laboratories through sets of different types of questionnaires or even tasks that you can give human subjects. And this has been done extensively. And across the entire body of data, and by that I mean literally hundreds of studies that have explored the relationship between particular neural circuits and neurochemicals, convergent and divergent thinking, we can arrive at a principle. And the principle involves a molecule that many of you have heard about before, which is dopamine. Dopamine is a neuromodulator. It's involved in motivation, and it tends to direct our attention to things outside of us, but it's also closely related to convergent thinking and divergent thinking and to the creative process. And therefore, it should come as no surprise that diseases of the nervous system, such as bipolar disorder, of which we've done an episode all about bipolar disorder, or schizophrenia, or mood disorders that impact the levels of dopamine, either make it way, way too high or way, way too low, strongly impact whether or not people will be creative. And I think the short takeaway that makes the most sense in terms of framing this, and we cover this on the episode on bipolar disorder, sometimes called bipolar depression, is that in professions where there's a lot of creativity required in order to succeed, so again, musicians, composers, artists, etc., you tend to find more manic depression, and manic depression, at least in the manic states, the hyperactive states, are correlated with elevated levels of dopamine. Likewise, it has been seen over and over throughout history that individuals that have mild forms of schizophrenia or even full-blown schizophrenia, many famous painters, for instance, or musicians, they are known to have elevated levels of dopamine, and they are quite creative. Now, that doesn't mean everybody who's creative has elevated levels of dopamine, although it's likely that their levels of dopamine are at least not diminished. And it doesn't mean that non-creative people have low levels of dopamine, so don't get carried away with the interpretation here. But the point is this. Dopamine levels strongly relate to the probability that you can engage in convergent and divergent thinking. And they do so in the following way. When dopamine levels are high, divergent thinking is more likely. That is, when people have a lot of dopamine circulating in their system, they tend to be very expansive with their ideas. They tend to brainstorm a lot. They tend to be comfortable and even want to, or reflexively, throw out a lot of ideas that sometimes even seem a little disconnected. Some people might think of this as kind of attention deficit, but it's not. It's really the idea of, throwing out disparate ideas, right? You hear sometimes, you throw things against the wall and see what sticks. Well, these people, that's obviously an analogy, but people are throwing lots of things against the wall and seeing what stick, and then seeing how the things that stick fit together. That's divergent thinking, and elevations in dopamine tend to increase divergent thinking. However, they tend to do this in kind of an inverted U-shaped way. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, I'm just drawing kind of a hump, obviously. And for those of you listening, just imagine a U, the shape of a letter U, and then just flip it upside down so it looks like a bump. Turns out that when dopamine levels are very low, there's a low probability of divergent thinking. When dopamine levels are high, as I mentioned before, there's a high level or probability of divergent thinking. But when dopamine levels go very, very high, then there's again a reduction in divergent thinking. In other words, there's a kind of a sweet spot of elevated dopamine for divergent thinking. And again, divergent thinking is critical for the creativity process because creativity by definition is taking a novel set of ideas and arranging them in a particular way, or taking existing ideas and arranging them in a novel way that then you eventually converge on some new product, new idea, new song, etc. Now, convergent thinking follows a very different pattern. When dopamine levels are high, convergent thinking is not very likely. And when dopamine levels are low, convergent thinking is very likely. So here, using arguably a very reductionist view, we're looking at all of this thing we're calling creativity through a very neuroscience-y reductionist lens, we can say this. The creative process involves going into a state where you're willing to consider a lot of options, many of which seem distantly or not even connected to one another. And dopamine facilitates that divergent thinking state in which you are perfectly happy and, in fact, experience a kind of a joy or elation, a comfort and a pleasure in organizing all these different ideas that to anyone else might seem not that related. But when your dopamine levels are elevated, these all seem like great ideas and that maybe there are connections there, right? You're not accepting all of them as true and valid and interesting and combining them, but there's this idea that it's worth entertaining the possibility, at least for moments. And then as dopamine levels drop, there is the process of convergent thinking, which is taking options down off the wall, saying, no, that doesn't fit with that doesn't fit with that, but that fits with that, and that can work. That feels right or sounds right or looks right. That's the creativity process. And so I think this is not just important for understanding cannabis, which we'll get back to in a moment, but it's important for understanding creativity and brain states in general. Brain states are not, as we would say, a square wave function. You don't just drop into a trench of creativity. Creativity is not an event. It's a process. And what I'm telling you is that it's a process that involves divergent thinking and consideration of a lot of different ideas. That's correlated with high, but not too high, dopamine. And then one has to transition into a state of convergent thinking, which is really homing in on the ideas that seem to have validity or that could have validity and getting rid of everything else. And that's associated with low dopamine. It's more about logical implementation and consideration as opposed to thinking about and considering everything.